Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking Santa Cruz MX bikes. These are all bikes I've owned in the past year and I'm excited to go through them. Santa Cruz's mixed wheel bikes offer a very fun do-everything attitude that encourages you to step up and step out of your comfort zone. We're going to focus most on the all-new Bronson versus the Nomad, but don't forget the 5010. All of these bikes ride on Santa Cruz's VPP suspension, but the all-new Santa Cruz Bronson has seen a fairly significant revision. I do imagine the 5010 and Nomad will see a revision in the next year or so, but I can't predict the future. Before we get into it, like, subscribe, and let me know what bikes you'd like to see compared. Let's get right into the fun stuff. Descending in the chunkiest conditions, the 5010 obviously struggles the most. I run the suspension rather firm for jumps and large compressions, so on tracks like the Tunnel Trail in Santa Barbara, I'm getting bounced all over the place. That said, this bike handles chunks so much better than the previous version, and with the 36 Öhlins up front, I was relatively confident. I just had to make sure to stay light on the bike. That brings us to the biggest question of the review, the Santa Cruz Bronson versus the Nomad in the chunk. I probably should leave it later in the review, but we're gonna start with it right now. The new Bronson suspension is supple and reactive in a way that I don't usually expect a Santa Cruz bike to ride. When you ride a number of different bikes on the same trails, you tend to adapt the bike to the trail. You get used to holding on more with one bike or riding the front with another. I try not to look at things like geometry until after the first ride, but you can't totally forget how a bike handles, so there's always a bit of expectation. This is where the all-new Rocky Mountain Altitude and Bronson caught me off guard. People talk a lot about pedal kickback, and while it is still a thing, the new Santa Cruz bikes are very predictable, and you get used to pushing into the bike with your heels and anticipating it. With the new Bronson, I could apply pressure more continuously without getting bucked. This equated to more control across more terrain. It was a feeling that encouraged more speed and allowed me to look further ahead without concern for a run out. I mentioned it in my 5010 review. The mixed wheel 5010 allows you to hang it out a bit more, but it's still important to spot your escape. On the Bronson, I was less worried about how to ride something out and more concerned with the next corner. But how does it compare to the Nomad? Well, it's still a 150 bike versus a 170 bike. You're going to find the end of the travel more often, and while I still would rather the Nomad at a place like Whistler, with a 38 on the front of the Bronson, you'd be hard pressed to overwhelm the bike as a whole. It comes down to speed and size. When things get really chunky and really fast, the Nomad still has the edge. Steeps. This is an interesting one, and one where I don't know that the Nomad actually came out ahead of the Bronson. The Nomad does have a slacker head angle, but just barely, and the Bronson with its higher front end may actually edge it out in this category. For big compressions, you still have the 38 and 170 millimeters of travel with the Nomad, but for control, the body position and the new suspension on the Bronson keep the brakes working longer. Lastly, the 5010, for just 130 and 140 millimeters of travel, does a commendable job. The body position is solid, I just had to make sure I had a plan for the run out. Next, jumping. The Nomad is just about the best enduro bike I've ridden for steep lips and big jumps so far. Yes, it's still a big bike, but I've been surprised the jumps I can ride. It seems to handle tight transitions better than just about anything I've ridden with 170 millimeters of travel. I mentioned it in the high pivot comparison, but that's where some of these enduro bikes really struggle, and it's probably the wheelbase that's fairly short compared to the Dreadnought or the Rocky Mountain Altitude. It's also probably my favorite bike on big jumps. It's predictable and stable without feeling like a sail in the air. When it comes to tight dirt jump style, the 5010 is great. I still may prefer the previous 27.5-inch version, but this version is so much better all around that I think it's a fair trade-off. Last, I feel the Bronson took a step back in this area. It doesn't pump with the same enthusiasm of the other two bikes, can be hard to generate speed on rollers, and feels a bit like a dog on big takeoffs. On-trail jumps and resort-style flow trails are just fine, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed. Finally, cornering. Mullet bikes love tight corners and pumping out of pockets. That mostly reigns true for these bikes. The Bronson, as with the rollers, doesn't pop out of corners with the same eagerness as the other two. Cornering isn't just about fast corners and changing direction. It's also about holding traction when leaning into off camber or around a chunky sweeper. Sometimes a dual 2.9er can outperform bikes in these conditions. In the long sweepers, the Bronson holds a line as well as its big brother. I like how both these bikes can two-wheel drift, mostly unintentionally, and are easy to catch. The 5010 has a similar feel, but lets loose much easier, and I more than once got caught out facing the wrong way down the trail. Again, I found myself more timid and holding on a bit tighter.
5010 rides the chief.
On the climbing side, there's no surprise here. The 5010 feels almost like a cross-country bike. I think dual 2.9ers still climb better, like the Tallboy, and I felt like my weight was a bit over the rear end, but when you stand up on the pedals, it goes. I almost prefer the body position of the new Bronson and Nomad for long climbs, but the 5010 is lighter and firmer at the pedals. When it comes to the Bronson and Nomad, they feel very similar, but the Bronson weighs less and has a lighter feel on the pedals. It's not hugely faster, but it is faster. All bikes do well for traction and switchbacks, but the 5010 does better than most for traction in this travel range. I didn't realize until putting this video together how close I had scored these bikes for climbing in the loam library, and I stand behind it. The biggest difference over a long day is going to be the weight. Usually I compare value and quality in this next section, but since these are all Santa Cruzes, it's kind of mute. So I'm going to compare them against the industry standard or the industry as a whole, and we'll talk a little bit about bike to bike. I will mention you can more easily find the Nomad and 5010 on sale, but Jensen does have the call for price tag on the newest Bronson, so there may be deals to be had. I got my Nomad as a Jensen exclusive build, and it was a pretty good value. I built the 5010 up from the frame, which usually means it's more expensive, but because of industry conditions, it worked out in my favor. The Bronson though was the most I've spent on a bike, and it's only the mid-tier, so that's pretty disappointing. It's in line with most of the industry, but I think the industry is a bit out of control right now. I'm fine with electronic shifting, but I don't think the performance merits the price increase. Overall, Santa Cruz is a premium brand, and if you're paying list, it's gonna hurt. For the Nomad and 5010, if you can find last year's colors, they're virtually the same bikes. When it comes to quality, I do view Santa Cruz as kind of the industry benchmark for a few reasons. First off, the fit and finish is extremely good. The paint looks great and has stayed glossy. There are scratches, but I've also crashed a little. It's the features like frame protection, specifically the bolt-on ones, as someone who transports their bike over the tailgate and have worn off more than one stick-on option. The collated hardware is another standout and stays tight. There aren't any weird standards. I will admit I'm not a huge fan of the headset, but it's been mostly issue-free. These bikes also don't have the seat post insertion of some other brands, and that can be disappointing, especially with the new Bronson. I should also mention the in-frame storage. It's the only one I know of on the market that has stops at the bottom, which keep things contained and quiet. Unfortunately, they went away from that on the new Bronson and Hightower, so I guess we're going back to losing things in the frame. You'll also notice I scored the Nomad lower for quality, and I should probably fix that, but when it arrived, there were a number of rattles. Those have since been remedied, but to be honest, I'm not sure how they all got fixed. As far as adjustability, they all have nearly the same 0.3 degrees of adjustment. It's not a lot, but I'm a fan of the bike as it is and don't see a need for more adjustment. When it comes to how these bikes are to live with, super easy. Threaded bottom brackets and 148 wheel spacing make maintenance easy, as well as replacing parts. The fully routed hose ports are also great. Sag can be hard to read, and the flip chip can use an extra set of hands, but it's not the worst and not something I mess with often. Last thing to cover for quality and value is the warranty. Santa Cruz has a lifetime warranty on the frame as well as the bearings, and they really have set the standard in the industry and are pushing other brands with that bearing warranty. I'm not going to say there's never an issue, but Santa Cruz has one of the quickest and easiest warranties I've dealt with. I haven't broken a frame, but wheels have been very quick with just pictures exchanged. You just ship the wheel back in the box they sent your replacement in. What can I say? The lifetime warranty on the frame and bearings really increases the lifetime value of these bikes. Final thoughts, and who are these bikes for? We'll start with the 5010. This is an easy one. If you want a short travel do-it-all trail bike with mixed wheels, this just may be the most well-rounded option. It'll handle some gnarlier days, but it's really there for big rides and big terrain. It would be my go-to for rides like the Monarch Crest and Kenosha Pass in Colorado. It'll get a bit overwhelmed on some of the chunkier sections, but if you're walking, it's not the bike's fault. It could also be a good option for someone with flatter trails or for someone who just has mellower terrain if they want an option that's more playful than just fast. Now the one you've all been waiting for, the Nomad versus the Bronson. I'm gonna kind of disappoint you guys and say there's still a need for both bikes. And personally, I would still own the Nomad if it were my only bike, and a Nomad as well as a 5010 if I had to. However, that's my terrain and what I want to ride. If I were more concerned with racing enduro and having a well-rounded trail bike, the Bronson may be the better choice. I'm very impressed with what the new Bronson can handle, and if I were upgrading an old Bronson, I wouldn't be disappointed. They took the old Bronson and increased its abilities at both ends. It climbs better, descends better, and is still a good all-mountain trail bike. It doesn't replace the Nomad. I imagine there will be a new, even more capable Nomad in the coming months, but the current bike is still incredibly viable, and I'm not sure if they can improve it at both ends like they did with the Bronson. If you're an enduro racer and want the most advantage on the descent, then you're still going to want to go Nomad. If your races have more pedaling or aren't often at the bike park, then the Bronson may be your bike. If you're set out to conquer trails and features, the Nomad is still the best option to ride it out. I'm not a believer in one bike for everything, and specifically not one bike for everyone. I mentioned in my DaVinci chainsaw review, it could be my one bike. Well, that's because I'm not racing to the top and generally not racing, period. I want a super capable trail bike and a park bike. Many modern DH bikes are just too much for the average resort. Now the Nomad is not compatible with a dual crown, so when I was looking to have two bikes, I wanted a DH or freeride bike for the bike park and maybe some shuttling, and the Nomad for big rides and the big terrain I was talking about with the 5010. I also wanted it so that if I was exploring in the woods or taking a trip to some unknown terrain, the bike would never be the excuse. Buy the bike for your expectations and ambitions. Don't let the marketing tell you what to do. It's up to you and what you want to ride. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't. We're doing bonus comparison videos all month that you're not going to want to miss. New videos drop every Friday. If you need anything for yourself or your ride, it's the holidays, so hit up Jensen USA and the other affiliate links on my channel's page. These support the channel at no additional cost to you. Now get out there, go fast, and take chances. See you next week.
Yeah! New feature! Woo! That is a nice new to me. Yeah, woo! Feels great.